We will take a break when you're done, and then
Yes,
we
sir.
can coffee and donuts in the intermission, okay?
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Well, good morning. Is that okay if I just kind of do this? Can you guys hear me a little bit better now? Is that good? We'll see with the clicker here in just a minute. But let me open us in prayer, and then we can kind of go from there. All right. Father in heaven, thank you so much for each one of the people that are here today. Thank you for Temple Baptist Church. Thank you for the ministry that it is to Jamestown. Thank you for the opportunity to come to your house and the privilege that always is. And I just pray this morning that as we think about our kids and we think about the environment that they're growing up in and what's going through their heads and their hearts, I pray, Father, that you'll help us to understand better how we can support them, how we can love them in a way that guides them towards you. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. So we have a lot to kind of get through today, and I'm a real fast talker, but I want you to know that if at any point you're like, hey, wait a minute, I want to know more about that, please, you're not interrupting me, please make sure that you raise your hand. It is a lot of information, and it's good that there isn't anybody under the edge of 10 in here, so I think that's good too. Not necessarily in this session, but the next session we'll get into some stuff that'll be a little bit darker and a little heavier for people that are under middle school. I'm going to tone it down for tomorrow for Sunday morning, though. But as Pastor said, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. Just a real brief on me. I know that you maybe have read the bio, but I own a few businesses that support people with severe and persistent mental illness, substance abuse. I've done things with homelessness in the past, and I own an organization in Minneapolis, St. Paul, that serves people with intellectual disabilities. We serve about 500 people up there. These days, I kind of consult, do a variety of things. I teach at a Christian university called Concordia in Seward, Nebraska, which is just outside of Lincoln. And I teach like abnormal psych and introduction to counseling, stuff like that. And then I provide counseling to some of their students, but mainly their faculty and staff. And so I don't know how much we'll get into that, but today really kind of the focus is really talking about this generation of kids and how different of a world they're growing up in and the way in which they seem to be internalizing that world and how very, very different it is. So let me see if I can click through. Let me ask, how many of us... Cool. Is that me or you, Brian? Is it? Oh, sweet. So how many of us this morning, sorry, I'm just going to go to the end of these. I don't know why it's set up like that. Okay, so how many of us have children that were born between 1994 and 2000? It says 10, but it's actually 12. Is that just about everybody? And so they are called iGen. You know, I was Generation X. I was born in the early 70s. After me were the millennials, right? And this generation started in 2010. It is the first generation that does not know a world that did not have the internet. In fact, to give you an example, my son, he's with us, and Corey's, Lieutenant Townsend's son is also with us. They're 13 and 14 years old, and my son asked me one day, he's like, so there really was no internet when you were growing up? I was like, there really was, and he was like, took him for a minute, and he's like, well, how'd you check your email? Like, he can't imagine what that would be like to not even have, you know what I mean? He can't even make a connection. Here's some good news about our kids, okay? And they're, you know, they've been around long enough that we're starting to pull some data together. So they have all these screens, as we know, right? But they are less likely to have conflicts with us. They're less rebellious behaviorally. They're less likely to use drugs and alcohol. They're less likely to have premarital sex. They're less likely to run away from home, actually. I don't know if that one's on there, but it's like 4 times less likely that this generation of kids are going to run away from home and do those kind of things. Oops. Sorry, did I bump something? They are very self-taught. And we know why they're self-taught, because all they have to do is Google anything they want to, and they just taught themselves whatever it is, good, bad, or somewhere in the middle, right, on things. They're very justice-minded. They want to make a difference in the world, right? And Pew Research says that they're going to grow up and they're going to be the most entrepreneurial, They're going to be the most conservative, and when we say conservative, we mean politically, financially, socially conservative. They're going to be the most racially and ethnically diverse and educated generation in the history of the world. So that's the good news about this generation. Here's some of the other side. If I can click it. I'm so sorry, Brian. Do you mind? Go ahead. I'll just wave at you. Is that okay? You can go ahead and click all the way through that and just fill the page out. So the other side of this is what we're finding, and I guess let me say this. We're going to cover this in about 45 minutes, and I want to make sure that we have some opportunity for you guys to talk, and we can do some question and answer and have a little discussion. But 45 minutes, I just want to say up front, does not give it justice. We're just barely going to scratch the surface here. And if you hear anyone say, including myself, that we've got it figured out, we don't. And it's very complicated out there. But let's start talking about what's happening out there. So they are reporting that they are very uncomfortable with face-to-face interactions. I can give you an example. Even the college kids, right, that are at the early end of this. I'll give them the option. We can do something where you can interact with a screen on your phone or your laptop, or we can do a group. We can split up into groups like we always did when we grew up, and no matter what grade it was. What do you think they always select, right? They'd rather just sit next to somebody, not talk to them, look at their phone, and then interact in that way. And to them, they think it's the same thing, right? But it's not, and we'll talk about why that's not. They're anxious, they're nervous, right? They are disconnected, and they know that they're disconnected. 67% of this generation, so not at Concordia, not in this church, but at large in the United States, are saying that they don't identify with a faith or a religion. Did you know that number was 93% the other way when I grew up in the 80s? Right? Simple things like, do you believe in the existence of God? That was like 90% in the 80s. And that one kid out of 10 that said they didn't believe in God just said it for shock value. Do you know what I mean? That's not true anymore. And there is a real fundamental moving away from not just religion and church, but from spirituality and from God in general. We'll talk about that certainly tomorrow. But those expectations on number 6, that's where the rubber is starting to hit the road for these kids. They are overwhelmed by their expectations that they have for themselves, that they believe others have for them, that they have of the world, and that they believe that their parents have, whether they're social or academic, right? They are the first generation that will tell you about themselves by telling you about someone else. Let me explain how that is. If you look at social media, how many times have we seen somebody post a video and say, look at what these people did, and then they make a comment on it? What they're actually doing is talking about themselves through someone else's experience. They're not actually telling you about themselves through their own experience. It's the first generation that does that. That let me tell you about me by talking about somebody else, right? This number 8, though, this is first generation ever that does this. So in polling these kids, they asked, so do you feel anxious, nervous, worried? Do you feel disconnected? Do you not like to have face-to-face contact, or do you feel like you're a little uncomfortable? Yes, 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 yes. How about your peer? You know what their answer is? I don't know. The first generation, since they've been collecting this information, they've been doing this since the 1920s, the 19-teens actually. So it's been 100 years we've been tracking generations, right? This is the first generation that says, I don't know how my peers feel. I can just tell you that this is how I feel. Ironically, they all feel the same way, but they are so disconnected, they have no idea what's going on with their best friend in terms of how they really feel or how they're identifying with things. We have the highest, so here's a little exercise. That's not a fun one, but how many of you, don't raise your hand necessarily, I just want you to think in your head, because this is a thing that was big in the 90s, right? How many of us have somebody in our family somewhere in the tree that died or had cancer? Just think for a second. Do you remember that? And I remember in the 90s, people saying, by the time that we all grow up and get older, we're all going to be impacted by cancer. We will have cancer somewhere in our family tree. Suicide is there now. Do you know for years and years and years and years and years, the number one leading cause of death, by the way, for kids that are under 18 years old is accidents, right? Car accidents, you fall down the stairs, drowning. They put all that stuff into one thing and they call it accidents. For decades, the number 2 reason for child death under 18 years old was cancer. And in the last 7 years, since 2012, suicide has passed cancer. Tomorrow we're going to talk about how in the last 3 years, it has passed not just cancer, but a variety of different things combined that you would think about as real concerns for your children, and suicide's still beating it. More kids are choosing to take their own lives today than cancer is taking it. And we'll talk about, again, especially in the second one, kind of how that is. Go ahead, Brian, if you don't mind. So here's some real quick stats on this, right? Greater than 25%, right, have a diagnosed mental illness. Greater than 25% have been treated for a mental condition. 60% of those diagnoses are depression and anxiety. Kids that are in college, and again, I mentioned that I do counseling. What I do is I do crisis intervention at Concordia. Did you know that in the United States, in the first 10 weeks of this semester in 2019, that we have had more completed suicides in the United States in American colleges than we did all of last year combined? It has been an epidemic in the last 3 years in particular for college universities to not just have kids come to college that are ill-equipped to be independent thinkers, problem solvers, and be able to do their own laundry and wash their own bed sheets. That was kind of the problem with my generation, right? These kids are ill-equipped emotionally, psychologically. And we're going to talk about kind of that profile and how that's changed here in a second. But 64% of the kids that went to college and aren't in college right now, it's because of a mental health crisis. We've sent 15 kids home this semester. We've had 14 suicide attempts on campus at Concordia. These kids, and again, we'll go through kind of the profile. These aren't troubled kids that sit with their hoods up in the back of the classroom. You know what I mean? This is the star volleyball player. This was last year's prom queen, or not prom queen, but homecoming queen that are attempting suicide. It's very, very different today. So we'll talk about that here in just a second. Go ahead, sir. So again, when I was growing up, you could almost point out who might be at risk. They're sitting in the back. They're pretty disinterested in class, disinterested in having friends, a little irritable, a rebel, rude to people in authority. And it just made you wonder, I wonder how their home life is and how disinterested maybe their family is. The kids today that are attempting suicide and are steeped in depression and anxiety are coming from our homes, college-educated homes, homes where we cooked every meal, we washed every clothes, we helped with every homework assignment, we took them to every ball game, we showed up to all their stuff, we participated in everything that they were a part of, right? And go ahead, you can click it, sorry. I'm sorry, go back. I'm sorry, I thought there was a picture there, sorry. It's in the next one. They're involved, they're social. These aren't kids that look on the outside like they're doing that. I'll show you in a little bit. I mean, they're like ducks out there. They're super calm on the surface, but they are paddling like the dickens underneath to try to stay afloat, right? And not that physical attraction, I put that on there. Not that is some kind of it sounds so superficial. But I guess the reason I put that on there is that this isn't like that quintessential person who has body image problems and is getting made fun of because they got a big nose, or they're too big, or they're too small, or they're too whatever. Man, there is no discrimination anymore between the kids that are depressed and will act on that in a very lethal way, or attempt to, and anyone else, right? Go ahead, Brian. So here's what I'm trying to, and again, here in a little bit, we're going to kind of walk through some things about what we can do, but I don't want to oversimplify it, and I certainly don't want to come across like I have a bunch of answers, because this is not an anecdote. Again, anyone that says that they understand the complexity of what's really going on out there, they're fibbing to you, because we don't know. So anyway, here's what's happening, in my opinion, and I came to this kind of idea when I was talking to some kids in college in the last couple of years. They would come to me, and, I didn't realize that's up there. Thank you. Has that been up there the whole time? Okay, good. I was like, anyway. So what ends up happening is people come in, and here's what's happening out there, is that kids are coming in, and they're like, instead of me saying, hey, my name is Kim, and here's where I'm from Indiana, and I went to school here. These kids come in, sit down, and say, hey, my name is Jill, and I'm depressed. My name is John, and I'm suicidal. It is becoming self-defining for them to define themselves. And their main characteristic of introduction is to talk about what's wrong with them and how their struggles and challenges are. It is right at the surface. I ask a couple of questions, and it's like opening the floodgates. It is right at the surface. So here's what I found, though, is that we'll sit down, and I tell them all the time, so I'll tell you guys, this is for all of us. It's not just for kids. Your problem's not your problem. It's what bothers you about your problem that's your problem. So let me say that again. Your problem is not your problem. We think, my problem's depression. My problem's my husband. My problem's school. My problem's my behavior. Your problem is not your problem. It's what bothers you about your problem that's your problem. So what I do is I have them, you see the different areas of life, and we go through and I have them just put a check mark. I have this on a sheet of paper. I hand it over to them. I just put a tick mark on the number of problems you have in each category. So they go around to social and sports and academic and family and my girlfriend doesn't like me and all that kind of stuff, right? And so before you know it, what you end up with is a page that has about 20 problems on it, 20 ticks on it. And I just look at them, I turn it back around, and I say, here's the deal. God did not create you to deal with 20 problems at a time. Your response to being overwhelmed, and that's normal. If you have 20 problems going on in your life and you're trying to handle all 20 of them at the same time, there's no way that's going to happen. You should feel overwhelmed, and you should feel depressed, and you should feel anxious. So your response to that is actually normal. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It means your response to that is normal. But let's just break this down just for a second. And so what we do is then I have them list out what was underneath each one of those check marks or each one of those ticks. And I have them prioritize it. What I tell them is that that's like having 20 things in a backpack that you're carrying around in life, right? And you're just weighted down by your problems, and it becomes, again, self-defining. That's why you walk in the door and say, my name is Jill, and I'm depressed, right? What we find, though, is out of those 20 problems, there's usually 2 or 3 that are carrying the most weight, that are causing the most weight. The other 17, are they something? Yeah, they're something. But they're more annoyances than they are anything else, right? And so we start to focus on the top 2 or 3 things. And we stop trying to think of 20 different problems and how we're going to solve them, because again, we aren't built that way. If we don't do that, over time, what it does is it takes up our inner self, so to speak. And again, it becomes self-defining. Go ahead, Brian. Yes?
Several times in my husband's and our lives that we would tell our kids that it's like you're carrying a pocket full of rocks.
Yes.
And if you slowly start taking a rock out, your day becomes a little bit lighter.
Yes. But if you try to get them all out, you might then your hand gets stuck, right? And the rocks get stuck, and you're not sure, you can, that's a good illustration too. I'd say it's just too bad, it really is. But we're going to talk about some things. So here's the arc of severity. If you can just click one more time, I'm sorry, I probably messed up. Oh, sorry, go back. You know what's interesting? Like all my pictures went away. That's okay, you can get the idea. So I put a sunrise and a sunset. Here's the thing real quick, I'll just talk about that, right? our severity of emotional and psychological kind of turmoil, I mean, it doesn't happen overnight. People will say, oh, he just snapped. Oh, they just, whatever. Did you know that's not a thing? Nobody snaps, right? It moves like the sun. Who knows exactly when the sun rises? Who knows exactly when the sun sets outside of God? I know they put it on the Weather Channel, but they don't really know either, right? Because it's a progression. It's a slow progression, almost unnoticeable. And before you know it, in the morning, you move out of darkness and into light. And before you know it, at night, we move from light into darkness, right? You ever eat dinner at night? This happened last night when we were at Applebee's. And we walked in, and it was daylight, right? You look out, and you're like, ooh, it got dark fast. You ever say that? It got dark fast. It didn't get dark fast. It got dark regular speed, right? It was regular speed. We just think it does. That's what happens with our emotional and psychological turmoil. We don't snap. It's just, here it comes, and then all of a sudden, oh my gosh, it's full blown. See what I mean? It's slow, but then it's sudden. And today's acuity is much, much higher, right? This year, I think I counted the other day, 18 students in the first 10 weeks that are cutting themselves. Do you know what I mean by that? Like they take a razor or whatever sharp, and they cut themselves in areas usually that you can't see, it's covered by clothing. They're doing it for emotional release. They're doing it as a self-punishment. They're doing it in a way to control something in their life that they don't feel like they can control. There's a lot of different reasons for why that's happening. Do you know when I was, my first job out of grad school was to run a psychiatric unit for children and young adults in Toronto. And that was 20 years ago, 21 years ago. And those kids would all be in the hospital. Self-harm 20 years ago was something you would be hospitalized for. Today, we don't have enough hospitals, right? Those are just the kids that reported. Those are just the ones that came and said, hey, by the way, do you want to look at my arm, right? So it's much more prevalent than that. There's increased symptoms that are, of course, leading to higher suicide rates, right? Go ahead and click the next one for me, Brian, thanks. And so it leads us to, I did this symposium and presented a lot of the same information to the faculty and staff at Concordia, and then a group of professors and staff at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And this guy raised his hand. I think he was one of the deans at UNL. He's like, hey, Kim, I appreciate all your information. That's super helpful. Here's the deal, man. Like, what are we supposed to do about that? And again, before we kind of go into this, I really don't want this to sound trite or like this is some kind of an antidote that's going to cure our kids at all. But it's just, I say these things to say that this is where we can begin. This is where it doesn't necessarily need a professional to be able to help to impact somebody and save their life, quite honestly. So I just came up with this little acronym because, like pastors, therapists like acronyms too, right? So ARC, assertiveness, resiliency, and connection. Go ahead, Brian. So encouraging our kids, our loved ones, the people that we love with, right, that we love, to take initiative for their own problem solving. So this is under the assertiveness. I can't tell you how many kids come in and talk to me, or that I meet with, of all ages. And what they do is they tell me about all the rotten things that have happened to them or are happening in their life, and zero of it, for them, do they feel like was inside their control. It's called locus of control. Have you ever heard that term before? It's Latin, and it just means where is the location of the control. For whatever reason, this generation believes that the location of the control does not reside in them, in their life. It resides in wherever else, right? So you've heard that term, he's such a victim, she's acting like a victim all the time. That's where that comes from, is a fundamental belief that the location of control in my life does not belong in me, it belongs somewhere else, and it is somewhere else. Having kids start to think about how they can take initiative for their own problem solving. So when they come in and they tell me about a problem, I don't give them a solution. Good therapists never do anyway, by the way. You never give solutions. You just keep asking questions to help them identify what's bothering them about their problem. Because again, their problem's not their problem, right? Number two, encourage them to control the controllables. And I literally make a list. Here are the things you can control. Here are the things you can't control. Now, you talked to me about things that you feel like you can't control. Let's go over them. Now, for each one of these uncontrollables, I want us to list what is controllable. Because in everything in life, there is an aspect of that for us that we can control. And what is that? Our response. Right? I get fired from my job. Right? I didn't control that. I can always control my response. Someone cuts me off in traffic. I can't control that. I can always control my response. Right? And that is actually what drives what the ultimate impact of that whole situation is on my life. That's how come two people can grow up in the same family, have the same abusive dad, and one person is impacted for the rest of their life in a terrible way, and the other one is not. It's about the response that the person had. That's why two people can go through a tragedy, like a car accident. And one person, it can be a traumatic event and wreck them for life, and for other people it doesn't, right? And number three, right, encourage them to take some action, to take some personal responsibility. It's really weird because with kids, oftentimes what they hear from us are things like, well, that's what my dad wants me to do. That's what my mom wants me to do, and I can either choose to either do it or not do it. Well, if we think like that, right, then who has the control? Dad and mom. See what I mean? Part of what we owe to our kids is to be able to help them to identify, how do you take responsibility, not me, for yourself, right? Instead of me telling you and then you deciding whether or not you want to obey me or not obey me, right? How are you going to obey yourself? How are you going to take that responsibility of your response? Because it's your life, right? And helping kids even separate that. Because, again, I'm not suggesting we don't tell our kids what they need to do and provide guidance. We should absolutely do that, of course. But at the end of the day, you can't force anybody to do anything that they don't want to do. The best kind of parenting is when we help enable them to make the right decision on their own. That's what we're trying to do anyway, right? That's why when they're like 2 years old and you walk up to like a intersection and you grab their hand, because they don't have the judgment to not run across it and not understand that there's moving cars that could kill them, right? Eventually what we want them to learn is to look both ways, take responsibility, right, for your own safety. That's what we're doing at a very fundamental level. For some reason, sometimes we don't do that emotionally with our kids. Let them learn how to take that responsibility. Just like you don't plan on holding your kid's hand across every intersection. At some point you say, I've shown you 20 times, I've said, look both ways before you cross 5 million times. At some point you're not going to be there. At some point I'm not going to be there next to you at the intersection. You need to take responsibility. Emotionally, we need to be able to teach our kids how to do that as well. Go ahead, Brian. How are we doing on time? Okay. Oh, we're doing good. Okay. So resiliency. We could talk a lot about how maybe as a society we are getting a little bit thin-skinned out there. Do you know what I mean by that? Everything's so personal. Everything's so touchy. Everything's so, we're so sensitive about things. And I'm going to talk just in a second about how come I think that that's happening to us. But let's just talk about what we can do as parents at first, which is to help them to not under or overreact to things. One of the biggest things that I'm doing with these college students and even with high school students is to just normalize their emotional response to trouble. Trouble with school, trouble with your parent, trouble with your girlfriend, failing your driver's license test, whatever, right? To normalize that feeling. Because for whatever reason, we seem to think that if I don't feel good all the time, there's something wrong with me. That's not true. That's life. Life has disappointment, and you should feel disappointed about the disappointments. And that's okay. That's not an over or under reaction. But somehow we think, oh man, I'm allergic to disappointment. I'm allergic to the possibility of failure. I'm allergic to someone looking at my insecurities. And so I got to get rid of that. Some way, shape, form, I got to hide that. I got to whatever kind of a thing. That's not true. In fact, it's not healthy. What it does is it just stuffs it down, stuffs it down, stuffs it down. And, people just become these, I don't know, like water on a, like a kettle on a stove. It builds the pressure, and then eventually it's going to blow, right? Number 2, encourage them to start identifying priorities based on things that are based in reality. One of the first things that I say to the students when I teach Introduction to Counseling, and you should just see their faces, I just tell them, hey, I want you guys all to know that out there, I know we're all going to grow up and we are going to get these awesome degrees and we're going to go out and have this career. I just want you to know right now, spoiler alert, there is always going to be somebody smarter than you. There's always somebody better than you. There's somebody richer than you. There's somebody better looking than you. You will find, if you live long enough, people that are just plain better than you all the way around. And you're going to find yourself in a situation where you feel inadequate and you're not good enough. I just want to kind of throw that out there for you so that we all kind of understand that that's true for every single one of us, right? And this idea that I can be perfect is unrealistic and a little bit silly. Life is about direction, not perfection, because no one is perfect other than Jesus Christ. So I tell them, unless you're Jesus Christ, and Jesus, if you're here, raise your hand. But if you're not Jesus Christ, then stop setting yourself up to believe that you can somehow become perfect, right? Number 3, encourage your loved one to adopt hope. One of the things that sometimes parents will talk to me about, or the faculty, they'll ask me, hey, Kim, what's the number one reason for suicide? So, what is it? Is it like financial problems, your wife leaves you, academic problems, you get kicked out of school, what is it? What's the number one reason? Here is the number one reason. Are you ready? It's always hope. More specifically, hopelessness. I can't tell you how many people that I've heard have been abused, did lose their job, their wife did kick them out, they lost a child, they've had terrible tragedy in their family, and they never once thought about suicide because they had hope. And I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that had attempted suicide in a very real way. And what they talk about is, I just didn't think it was ever going to get better. I lost hope. That's the number one reason people kill themselves. It's not this one thing, and if we can solve this one thing, then we'll stop suicide from happening. That's not true, right? We know the answer, and tomorrow we're going to talk much more about it, but here's a spoiler alert for tomorrow that I know that you guys already know. Where is the hope? It's in Christ. The whole message of the gospel is a simple message of hope. It is hope for the separated from God. It is the hope for those that are on their path to eternal damnation. Right? People don't reject Christ. We know that, right? You know what they do? They reject the premise that they need Christ. That's why people aren't Christians. It's not that they've studied Christ and have come to the conclusion that Christ isn't the answer. They haven't come to the conclusion that they even need an answer. And what they're doing is they're looking and hoping for and hoping for and hoping for something else to fulfill them that only Christ can do. Right? Let's go to the next one, Brian. So, connection. Man, I'm telling you, our social networking and social media, it ought to be called antisocial. media and antisocial networking. We are becoming so disconnected from each other. We are becoming sound bites. We are becoming these folks that, gosh, you believe this one thing, so that means you believe all the other things that are connected to that one thing, right, in society. And we all go into what are called echo chambers, right? If we all looked at each other's phones and computer search engines, we see that we all, there's a particular set of areas that we go get news from and our information from that we believe or we don't believe. And we just repeat back to ourselves in an echoing way what we already think. Our kids are doing the same thing, except they don't have our judgment. They don't have our experience. They don't have our life wisdom. They're just taking it all. I tell people all the time, kids, especially teenagers, man, they have the bodies of a semi, right? But they have a filter of like a Ford Escort. Remember those? Right? It's impossible for them to filter that. But they've got the body, they've got the verbal skills to be able to, and they have access to a roadway like a semi. Right? I wasn't exposed to anywhere near that stuff in the 80s. My parents were worried about MTV. Remember that? Yeah. So we didn't get MTV because my parents were so worried about MTV. Holy smokes. My parents were worried that, I might listen to some music that says a bad word. And so, remember the PMRC in the 80s and Tipper Gore? And she created a way that we rate our music, right? And then our video games. Well, I'm not even sure that even means anything anymore, does it? Because if you have access to it for free, unless you're gonna, So anyway, encourage them to become more involved in church groups, right? Part of the reason Corey and I are here together, we've been buddies for the last few years. Pastor Steve let us lead the middle school boys for the last couple of years together. Part of the reason we're here together is specifically because we want our boys to develop a relationship together. I know that probably, again, when we were all younger, our parents thought the same way. Boy, I hope you have some Christian friends. I hope you can have some people that really kind of share our faith, and that's going to be helpful. Man, now more than ever is that important in doing and having those real personal connections with people that are like-minded in faith. And help and encourage your loved one to seek help, right? Here in a little bit, we're going to talk about suicide and depression and all those kind of things. I want us to get a chance to talk before we get into the next stuff. But, man, there is a time for us to sit down and talk to professionals. I'm a professional, but I can tell you that if there are things that would bother my children, I would want them to go to somebody else. There is something different about talking to somebody that's not your mom and your dad and responsible for all the things and tells you what to do and all that kind of stuff. It is different. And so giving avenue for their voice to be heard in a way that they don't have to worry about, what if dad finds that out and I get in trouble and he takes, my video game system away from me for the week. That kind of stuff, right? We've got to find avenues for them to be able to kind of talk. But specifically, I'm glad to hear, Jerry, that you're here. I'm glad that the church invests in having a counselor, someone that's available to talk. Man, they need those outlets. I think that might be it, Brian. Yeah. Okay, so I talked fast, and that's a lot of information in 40 minutes. But your turn. Do you have questions, comments? Yes.
How do you bring up, like, say you have, like, a teenager or preteen or whatever?
Yeah.
How do you, like, have a discussion about suicide and stuff with them without them being like, oh my God, Mom, I don't want to hurt myself?
Yeah. So, and kids are like super, we all are that way. It can get a little bit defensive. Even if we are going through that, we wouldn't necessarily do that, right? Oftentimes for kids, if you really think about it, what they connect with, and I was just telling Corey this morning, our boys, again, are 13, 14, And I said, man, they're right at that age where they actually value their peers and their atmosphere's feedback more than ours. And so what I encourage parents to do is to give a social example. So you're actually not directly asking them about them. You're talking about 13 Reasons Why. Have you guys seen that? If you haven't, you should watch part of it. It's a little disturbing, though, so watch it when they go to bed. But 13 Reasons Why is a Netflix series about a girl who completes suicide, and then she makes these tapes and sends them out across the school and tells them why they're all to blame for her suicide. And my guess is a lot of your kids have seen it. We might not know that they have, but they have, and they're discussing it at school. So I use examples like that. Unfortunately, suicide is in the newspaper, right, when that happens. And whether it's about a child suicide, right, or I understand that, there were 2 suicides here in the last month in this community. That's an opportunity for us to talk about those things with their kids and to just ask them, right? Have you ever felt alone? Have you ever felt like everything in life is so bad that it's never going to get any better? You don't have to use the word suicide or kill yourself or any of those dramatic kinds of terms. And again, in this next session, we're going to talk about that much deeper. But it is important to ask those questions and have them steer that. Even asking just basically, what did you think of that? Have you heard that there was someone who took their own life last week? I'm going to guess they did. They might have heard about it before you did. What did you think about that? How do you feel about that? And just ask them. Again, it's really too bad that we're having these kind of conversations with our kids, because we really shouldn't be at this age. But they're living in a completely different world than we are. I'm not even sure that I knew what the word suicide meant when I was 10 years old. But it's the fastest growing age for suicide in America is 10. I'm not even sure I knew what that word meant at 10. Right?
We have 3 children, and I think each of our 3 children have had a friend or 2 that have committed suicide. And watching our kids then process that and dealing with it, it was always concerning.
It's tough. There is absolute research that suicide, but I would also say at a lesser extent, depression, anxiety, there's what's called a contagion effect. It can work like a disease. And kids can become exposed to that and just think and think and think, and the next time they've got troubles, they think to themselves, you know what, Johnny's not being made fun of anymore, and I am. Maybe that's I tell the kids in college all the time, man, life is like a vending machine. You go up, you invest in something, you look at what your choice is, you make a choice, you push the button, and you get what you get, right? Here's the difference, though. None of us have the same vending machines. And for our kids, suicide seems to be in the vending machine. That was not in my vending machine. And maybe for a lot of us, that wasn't in that would have never even appeared as a choice. It's appearing as a choice now to very, very young people. Any other questions? Hey, Corey. No, you're good. We're all done. You guys need a break?
We have donuts and coffee in the back.
Well, let's go eat. Hey, thank you guys for your attention. Appreciate it. We'll come back here in a little bit and we'll talk through some more stuff, okay? Thanks.